Online with Terry Jeffry, a CNS News production.
Welcome to this edition of Online with Terry Jeffry. Our guest today is Virginia Delegate Bob Marshall. Marshall has been a member of the Virginia House of Delegates since 1991. Over his 20 years in that office, he has often been at the center of battles in the state of Virginia that reverberated nationwide. In recent times, he has been at the center, or the epicenter of the struggle over the constitutionality of Obamacare. Delegate Marshall, thanks for coming in.
Terry, thanks for having me on.
As you know, the state of Virginia at the founding of this nation was instrumental in the fact that a Bill of Rights was actually attached to the U.S. Constitution. In the Virginia ratifying convention, it was a major issue whether there would be a Bill of Rights. You had people like Patrick Henry and George Mason insisting that there be a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. James Madison, one of the primary authors of the Constitution, was a Virginian who actually attended the ratifying convention of the state of Virginia. Initially, did not think a Bill of Rights was necessary. He thought that the limited powers of the federal government were clearly spelled out in the Constitution. But eventually he went over to the other side. And in the end, as a member of the first U.S. House of Representatives, he actually authored and sponsored the Bill of Rights, of which number 10, the 10th Amendment, reserved to the states and the people those powers that were not delegated to the federal government in the Constitution. Now, you've been at the center of a battle over Obamacare.
Right.
Tell us about the Virginia Healthcare Freedom Act that you sponsored and that was signed into law in Virginia.
Well, when the debate was going on in Congress, I try to avoid Congress as much as I can, but when I saw them spilling over into what I thought was an area that was reserved to the states, I decided I had to read the bill after a grandmother in Richmond called me up and says, Bob, you really got to pay attention to this. I'd been looking at it, but she said this, and I said, okay, let me do this. Well,
so you actually read that monstrosity?
Enough of it to annoy me. That's all I had to do. So when I read the part about an individual mandate, I said, this doesn't seem right. So I went back and reread some of the debates, the ratification debates. I've got Madison's notes on the Constitution. I couldn't find anything. I couldn't even find Supreme Court decisions that were bolstering this point. So I said, I've got to do something here. So I devised what eventually became the Healthcare Freedom Act, House Bill 10, and it passed. And it put Virginia in a situation of having direct standing to sue because Virginia was directly injured. This simply wasn't a constitutional case. We had passed a statute to protect residents and citizens in Virginia from this requirement.
Now, what does the Virginia Healthcare Freedom Act say exactly?
It says you can't be compelled to purchase private health care insurance. So that was the basis upon which the Attorney General filed in court and so far has won at the district court level, and he's appealing that at this present time.
So at the very same time that the U.S. Congress, with the whole nation watching, was debating Obamacare and very narrowly passing this bill, the Virginia legislature was debating a proposal by you.
Correct.
That would specifically say that you or me or anybody else in the state of Virginia, I'm a resident of the state of Virginia, could not be forced by the federal government or anybody else to purchase health insurance.
Correct.
And a majority of the Virginia legislature passed that and the governor signed it.
I got Democrats and everybody, independents, Democrats, Republicans to vote for it.
And so the federal lawsuit that's been filed by Attorney General Cuccinelli of Virginia against Obamacare is based on defending your law?
Yes. This is, some people confuse this with nullification. This is not nullification. We're addressing usurpation of a power that was never given to Congress either by the original convention or any of the 27 amendments that have been adopted since then. We're saying you don't have the authority to do this. The contrary is, if you do have the authority to do this, there's nothing you can't do. So this is like a if-then, we're in big trouble.
And you had Democrats, you say, that were supporting this proposition in the state of Virginia.
Including African-American Democrats, right.
And so if Cuccinelli's Virginia case prevails in the U.S. Supreme Court, your Virginia Healthcare Freedom Act will stand.
That was the reason for it, correct.
And if Cuccinelli's case does not prevail in the Supreme Court, the federal government will effectively have overturned this law saying that Virginians cannot be forced to purchase health insurance.
It's Hail Mary time, even if you're Protestant.
How much of a change do you think this represents in the relationship between both states and individuals and the federal government on the other hand?
Well, the federal government at that point will have become a government of unfettered powers, and that was not the original intent. The states have plenary powers to do a number of things, federal government was given a specific enumeration of powers. And in fact, even Hamilton said it would be useless to enumerate powers if in fact a plenary power was suggested by the convention. So Hamilton, is the biggest exponent of centralized power, said no, an unlimited grant of power was not given to Congress. No matter how nice the idea might be, you can't do everything that just feels good.
And it is in fact true that up until this moment, the federal government has never in the history of the country ordered individuals to buy any good or service.
Never attempted any private individual to enter into a contract, and that was asserted not just by me, but by the Congressional Research Service, which is the attorneys that Congress hires. The Congressional Budget Office said, we can't find any statute that we ever did this to. So that this is clearly a radical shift. This really, Terry, is a constitutional amendment without going through the process of Congress passing it by 2/3 and 3/4 of the states ratifying it. This is a radical change in our form of government without following the process of amendment.
If a majority of the federal Congress with the signature of the president can tell people in Virginia or any other state that they must purchase health insurance, and it must be a health insurance plan approved by the federal government, is there any reason that the federal government couldn't order us to buy broccoli once a week?
Or asparagus. No, I mean, again, there is no limit to the power that can be exercised if, in fact, the Supreme Court sustains this. That's why this is very dangerous. And frankly, I think it is the new Justice Kagan, who was Solicitor General. In my mind, she should recuse herself before she makes a decision on this.
Why
it hasn't gotten that far.
But CNS News has filed a Freedom of Information Act request where we're seeking records relevant to whether or not Elena Kagan, as Solicitor General, discussed President Obama's health care plan, or whether she discussed the legal challenges to the legislation he actually signed, or communications or meetings that she might have been involved in which she discussed the possibility that she might need to recuse herself in her role as Solicitor General from any particular case, because where she confirmed to a federal court that case might come before her. That FOIA request is pending. In fact, the Justice Department is contesting it in federal court. But you would say even before we see the record, the actual record in the Justice Department that would demonstrate whether or not Elena Kagan did in fact discuss the merits of...
It was the policy of the Obama administration, for which she was the Solicitor General, to defend their policy, that our claim was not constitutional. She should recuse herself at that point. So, whether or not she discussed it with the lower down attorneys.
Right. So you would argue that the Obamacare was signed on March 23rd, 2010.
Correct.
The Virginia suit was filed that very same day.
Or a couple of days, right.
At that time.
Very close, right, yes.
And President Obama nominated her to the Supreme Court on May 10th, 7 weeks later.
Yes.
A week after that, she wrote a letter to the Supreme Court saying that essentially she was recusing herself from her core duties as Solicitor General as of May 10th. But you would argue that because she was Solicitor General...
At the time that it was signed, at the time Virginia passed the law, yes.
And remained in that position for 7 weeks. That mere fact...
That policy that she was defending, she should say, I can't make a decision.
Because even, you say she was defending. Now, let's, assuming for the sake of argument, to give her the benefit of the doubt, that during that 7-week period she never discussed the suit, she wasn't personally involved in making any decisions of it, but she did, in fact, hold the role of Solicitor General. Are you arguing that simply because she was Solicitor General and the federal government was taking a position against the Virginia case, that in and of itself she should recuse herself?
Yes. She was, quote, tainted. It's not really tainted, but she was implicated in an opposition to our statute.
It was like she was a member of a law firm that was fighting your statute,
Correct.
And now she's on the court.
Well, she was a member of the firm.
Happened to be the United States
That's
Justice
right.
Department.
That's right.
Okay. Do you anticipate that she might actually recuse herself?
I hope she comes under severe criticism if she doesn't.
Okay. Let's talk about another issue where there's been significant conflicts between state governments and federal governments, and where some communities, including your own, in the state of Virginia, have taken a very aggressive stance. This is the issue of immigration.
Right.
In Arizona, a law was enacted that more or less directed local law enforcement, when they pulled someone over for another cause, to determine whether or not that person was in the United States legally. This
Right.
caused national uproar.
Right.
The Obama Justice Department is going against it. You have similar things going on in Prince William County. How far do you think state and local governments should go towards enforcing immigration law or trying to determine the legal status of someone in the United States?
Well, they should apply to the INS to get permission, as it were, to enforce the statutes, this 287G requirement. But I think states can go further than that. I wrote all 4 border state governors, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, California, urging them to themselves build a wall between the United States and Mexico if the federal government doesn't do it. They also could use their own National Guard troops, because each governor is commander-in-chief and has authority to repel invasions. I had never got an answer back, but frankly, I think the state governments can do that.
You would think that in Arizona, at least, if not in California, that might be a very popular thing. Did you get any response from the
No
governors?
response from anybody.
No response
I
at
sent
all.
all 4 governors a letter asking them to do this.
Okay, now obviously you don't represent any one of those 4 states, but
Right.
Virginia has a significant illegal alien population.
Correct.
You mentioned 287G.
Right.
This is a federal provision, a law, that allows local law enforcement to be trained to actually enforce.
Be trained. Actually, what it is, the federal government gets a free ride. We enforce their laws that they're not enforcing, whether from lack of appropriations or just they're overwhelmed. That's what's going on.
So it's actually existing federal law.
Correct.
That the Prince William Sheriff's Office or the police in
We
Manassas
do it right now, yes.
can in fact enforce
Yes.
the immigration law.
We do enforce it right now.
And is it your sense that the Obama administration is cooperating and helping local law enforcement in your district of Virginia?
They cooperate to some extent. We had a couple of tragic events. We had a triple murder about a month ago, and last summer we had a guy who was here illegally, driving in the morning, killed 1 nun, injured 2 others who live in my district. That's sparked a considerable outrage among citizens. But then again, deportation orders did not normally include DUIs or these other offenses. Now I hope they're going to make a change.
There was an incident in your district in Virginia where someone had previously been arrested for a
Correct.
DUI.
Right.
He was determined after the fact that he was arrested to have been an illegal alien.
Correct.
And he was allowed to stay in the country.
Because the federal government did not list simple DUI as itself a sufficiently serious offense to be deported. I attended a meeting in Nokesville in my district, and I talked to one of the policemen there. They said, we're seeing these people that we deport, even the ones that they take, they come back about a year later. So clearly, the border is the problem. I remember reading a hearing from the House of Representatives, their immigration subcommittee. A fairly high-up official in Homeland Security, Richard Stana, told members of the House that persons of interest, it was what he called, are coming in courtesy of the Mexican drug gangs from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. They're not here for any good reason. Why aren't we down there? I mean, we've got troops in Afghanistan, we've got troops in Iran. Put some troops on the border. Nationalize the National Guard if the federal government has to do it. When they were down there before, their guns weren't loaded. That's not smart.
Now, this individual who was let go after being arrested driving under the influence, what happened then?
He was just out and around. Then he got drunk again and killed somebody this time.
He ended up killing people because
Correct.
of that.
Now this is a second-degree murder or serious charge at this point.
And do you believe now that the Department of Homeland Security has changed its policy towards dealing with someone like that?
Congress has to appropriate the money to handle all these deportations. Very often, we pick people up, the local jail makes a contact, but they can't do anything because there's no room, quote, there's no room in the inn to hold these
They let the guy
folks.
go because there isn't a bed to incarcerate him.
Correct.
So you would advocate that, notwithstanding the current budget problems, which we're all familiar with, that the Republican House majority, one thing they ought to actually spend more money on is detention of illegal aliens.
Detention centers to hold people for deportation, correct.
And you believe that is a core constitutional function of the federal government?
Protection of the citizens from invasion is a core fundamental function. of
And
the federal
regulating immigration,
government. Correct.
which is expressly part of Article 1.
It used to
Section
be
8.
up until the 1890s that states could do it as well, but that was taken away from.
Okay, now let me ask you about the abortion issue. In the federal level right now, there's a debate over whether or not the Republicans ought to agree to allow Planned Parenthood funding to continue. Planned Parenthood, its own annual report says it gets something in the neighborhood of $350 million a year in government funds. It aborts 320,000 something babies every year. Representative Mike Pence of Indiana introduced an amendment that initially was approved in the first CR that the Republican House approved that expressly prohibits any funding to go to Planned Parenthood, any affiliate of Planned Parenthood. Do you support that amendment on the federal level?
Absolutely. In 1976, I in fact took research which showed that the HEW, it was called then, had funded about 330,000 abortions. I pulled former Republican Congressman Bob Bauman off the floor of the House of Representatives and gave him this information. He said, "I've got just the guy that gives this to." Turned out it was Henry Hyde. So I kind of like, did the original research for that, and I subsequently worked for Bob Dornan and Jeremiah Denton, both of whom thought that Planned Parenthood should not receive a dime of federal funding.
Now, of course, the Hyde Amendment still exists. It's language that's put into every annual appropriations bills. But Planned Parenthood has gotten around the Hyde Amendment, have they not?
They've gotten around it because the current administration has backed away from the counseling requirements that the Reagan administration previously held, which were sustained at the U.S. Supreme Court level.
Right.
What they're saying is we're using this pot of money for the abortions and we're using this for the counseling. I wouldn't give them a dime because they're doing that.
Which is what Pence's amendment does.
Correct.
Pence's amendment expressly denies funding to Planned Parenthood. Now, let me ask you how this translates down into the state of Virginia. First of all, does the state of Virginia currently give money to Planned Parenthood?
We stopped the contracts the governor did last year. I had an amendment which passed the House but didn't pass the Senate-House conference, which said a locality may not take any of its money and subsequently give it to Planned Parenthood. I got about 58 votes for that in the House out of 100, but the House conferees couldn't convince the Senate that. So that still can happen. I don't know to what extent it is, but it's allowable under our law.
So even if the federal bill passes and federally Planned Parenthood is defunded by the government, in Virginia, taxpayers may still see their money go to Planned Parenthood?
It would be coming from the local governments, not directly from the state.
So Fairfax County or Prince William
Arlington
County?
or Alexandria, right.
They may take tax money and give it to Planned Parenthood.
Right.
But the central government of the state,
We're not
in
having
Richmond, is not.
contracts. Correct.
Now, what about abortion in the state of Virginia? Is there any statewide funding coming from the state coffers
They
that goes
allow
into abortion?
abortion for fetal handicap, which I don't think you should do, or if there's been a sexual assault. To me, your right to life is inviolable, regardless of your origin or whether you're perfectly healthy or not.
Fetal handicap, does that mean to say that in the state of Virginia, if a baby has Down syndrome, the state will pay to kill the baby? If the baby does not have Down syndrome, the state will not pay to kill the baby?
Correct.
Do they have like an
I
actual
don't support
list?
that. I mean, look, first of all, there's misdiagnosis, and secondly, I don't care. You're made in the image of God, whether you're handicapped or disabled or not.
You oppose abortion in all circumstances, correct?
Period.
From the moment of conception.
Period.
And government funding of abortion.
Oh, absolutely.
Your position would be abortion from the moment of conception should be prohibited in the state of Virginia, if not
In all states, correct.
and nationwide.
Right.
Globally, if we could do it, you would do it.
Well, right.
But so right now in your state, which is generally perceived as being more conservative than
Mm-hmm.
others on social and cultural issues, the state legislature is actually letting sit a law that says we decide that this baby is imperfect, therefore we'll subsidize the termination of that baby's life.
We had a previous statute before that came from the 1980s that authorized this type of abortion to be paid for with tax money. Prior to that, I had put amendments on the budget that says we're not paying for any of them. But again, that would only go so far because the House and Senate conferees would never agree.
I mean, this is direct eugenics, is it not?
Sure it is. And look, but we're the state with Buck versus Bell, remember?
Right.
Carrie Buck, who was sterilized because the Supreme Court justice,
This is in the 1930s.
three
correct?
generations of idiots is enough, right?
But presumably Virginia has changed quite a bit in the last 80 years. But not in this particular regard.
Not enough that we still have this on the books.
Is this something that, now, Virginia, in its most recent election, went completely Republican, correct? Is there any movement by the Republican government of the state of Virginia to at least prohibit funding of abortion for eugenics?
I could not get that passed. And so I went this year for an amendment on Planned Parenthood, which was the one that was basically fomenting this. It just doesn't work. But we did get a bill passed this year that says we're going to regulate these abortion providers. And the abortionists have said that if we implement the regulations that we say we would, but 17 of the 21 abortion centers would be shut down.
But in the Virginia House of Delegates,
Correct.
it has a Republican majority.
We can pass these restrictions there, but we can't get them passed in the state Senate, which is run by the Democrats.
Okay, all right. So it's Democrats in the Virginia State Senate that would block legislation that would say Virginia taxpayers don't have to pay for
There's two Democrats who
eugenic
would
abortions.
vote for the right to life. One's in Prince William, one is way down Southwest Virginia.
Okay, let's talk about marriage in the
Sure.
state of Virginia. Is same-sex marriage legal in the state of Virginia?
I'm the author of the Marriage Amendment. In 2003, when I saw the Lawrence v. Texas decision, I decided at that point that I was going to make it very hard for the advocates of the homosexual agenda to make any progress in Virginia. So within a week, I wrote an op-ed for the Richmond Times, which they published. In 2004, I put in a statute which said, Virginia will not recognize any out-of-state civil union. We previously, in the late 1990s, said we're not recognizing out-of-state same-sex so-called marriages. So I upped the ante. I overrode Mark Warner's objection to this, but this was part of a longer process. In 2005, I and two other members introduced versions of a marriage amendment. They passed a version. I was not on the conference. I would have changed the wording. Didn't happen anyway. 2006, I'm the chief patron of the marriage amendment. I debated this all around Virginia at very hostile audiences at colleges. I had two guys stand up and turn their back to me at UVA Law School. But anyway, the voters approved that with 153,000 more votes than Jim Webb received, who beat George Allen by about 8,000 votes.
And that amendment says that in the state of Virginia, only a union of one man and a woman will be...
We're not going to recognize anything other than one man, one woman, nor can you approximate the so-called rights to this by some other legal arrangement.
Now, historically in the United States, marriage law has been a state province.
Correct.
It's not been a federal province.
Right.
So the 10th Amendment that we talked about at the beginning of this interview comes into play. The Defense of Marriage Act, which was signed into law by President Bill Clinton, not a notable social conservative, said that the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, which ordinarily requires states to recognize contracts in other states, could not be used to force states to recognize marriages in other states.
Right.
Do you feel that Virginia's marriage law is now under threat because the Defense of Marriage Act may be overturned by the courts?
If we don't defend this, and there are cases, from New England, there's one in California, we need to defend this. The Attorney General would agree with me on this. Congress does have the authority to suspend the normal requirement of states to recognize the public acts of other states. And in this case, they did it. What is really disturbing here...
Right, the Constitution specifically gives Congress that power.
Right, to do that, yes.
This is not something they made
No,
up.
they didn't
it's
make it
actually
up.
in the language of the Constitution.
They can make such exceptions as they want. They made an exception here, and I'm glad they made the exception because of what was going on. It was overwhelmingly passed in the House and the Senate in 1996. Of course, Bill Clinton signed it at midnight, so he didn't want to get any publicity.
He did sign it.
Yeah, he did sign it.
Right.
So, but what is very disturbing is the action of the current president, who just decides on his own this is unconstitutional, despite the fact that he takes an oath of office which says that he will see to it that the laws be faithfully executed. Now, if he actually does have a conscience problem on this, and that's debatable,
right,
he should tell Eric Holder, you need to appoint a private law firm to defend this. But frankly, when he suckered in the Joint Chiefs of Staff to say that we're going to repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but we'll still enforce DOMA, he was misrepresenting the case at that point.
Now, leaving aside the merits
Correct.
of President Obama's opinion
Right.
or position, if a pro-life conservative were president and Congress were to enact a law saying that all states had to have legal abortion, to Freedom of Choice Act, legislate Roe v. Wade, and that law was challenged in the federal courts, wouldn't it be acceptable for a pro-life conservative president to say, I'm not going to defend that law in the courts? Isn't that distinct from actually executing the law and making sure it's enforced?
Well, I would find some way out of it if I were the president, or I'd resign. Period.
But under the Constitution, doesn't the president have his own discretion in terms of what he will or will not advocate in the Supreme Court?
He can do that, but then he does have to defer to somebody else to do this. Now, he could say, I'll let somebody else do. He could drag his feet. He could veto it. That's why I wouldn't get in a position of being in the executive office. I'm more into policy, so I wouldn't want to be, a governor or a president like that.
What is in the current Supreme Court? You have 4 justices that seem to be consistently conservative
Correct.
in their votes. You
Right.
have Clarence Thomas, you have Alito, Scalia, and the Chief Justice, John Roberts.
Then you've got Kennedy.
You have Kennedy in the
Right.
middle.
Right.
Is your anticipation that Anthony Kennedy, this singular Supreme Court justice, happened to be nominated by Ronald Reagan, will be the person who decides whether or not Virginia is forced to have same-sex marriage?
Well, let me tell you, if they take such a radical step, first of all, you've got 30, I 36 or 38 states with constitutional amendments on this.
Right.
And there was a statement by a writer around the turn of the last century, Peter Finley Dunn, Mr. Dooley, the court follows elections. To me, it would be very radical for the court to do this, to say yes. First of all, in 1868, when the 14th Amendment passed, all but one state made sodomy a felony. And if the 14th Amendment is being used, as the former Solicitor General for Bush thinks it can, how do you say that we have this 14th Amendment on the books, which was ratified by the same people who had anti-sodomy laws as a felony? It doesn't make historical sense.
But it still comes down to Anthony Kennedy, don't you think? That the way he votes will determine whether or not DOMA is overturned.
Correct.
If DOMA is overturned, under the legal situation, then would Virginia and other states like Virginia be forced to recognize same-sex marriages that are contracted in Massachusetts?
Repealing of DOMA is the first level. You then go back to, do we have sufficient protection on our own to say this is not the public policy of the state, race is not the same as sex, the Virginia versus Loving case. No, that just sets the stage for another set of lawsuits.
So you anticipate the battle would continue in the court. You would anticipate Virginia would continue to fight the battle in the courts.
As long as this current Attorney General is there, correct.
To defend its marriage law. Last issue I want to ask you about, Delegate Marshall. The Federal Department of Education periodically goes out and tests school students all across the country in reading and math and some other core subjects. They're called the National Assessment of Educational Progress Tests.
Federal department, which hopefully might expire at some point.
Right. This is one of the functions of that. What they say in their most recent report, they put out report cards on math and reading for all the states for tests that they gave in 2009, but these are the most current tests. They say that in Virginia, in the public schools, 29% of the 8th graders rated proficient in reading and 9% rated advanced. So only 38% of Virginia public school 8th graders were proficient and better in math. The rest weren't. In reading. In math, it was 35 rated proficient, 7% rated advanced. So 42% of Virginia public school 8th graders were grade level proficient in math or better, but the rest were not. A majority were not.
Was this public schools or above?
This is 8th grade public school students. This is not private school students. The private school students and the Catholic school students do better. But my question to you is, even though Virginia, according to these statistics, does better than some other jurisdictions, is this acceptable?
Not to me. No, I mean, look, that's why I support school choice and have done so before I was elected to public office.
If you had your way, would Virginia pass a law that gave a voucher to every parent in the state equal to the cost of educating a student in the public schools in their jurisdiction?
Voucher, tax credit, whatever is constitutional under Virginia's law. Matter of fact, we did have a bill this year, which I was very supportive of, introduced by a delegate from Richmond, Delegate Massey. Again, it passed the House. We even had African-American students and parents testify for this. Failed in the Democrat Senate.
So in your state, the barrier to school choice as a remedy to these sort of test
Is
scores
the Democrat State Senate.
is being blocked by the Senate.
Yes.
But you believe a change down the road, this is a potential reform that could take place in
We
your
even
state.
had an African-American legislator from Florida, a Democrat, come up and who first opposed this but then supported it because Florida has a statute that is allowing this and the students are performing very well. He came up, we still couldn't bust through or break through the opposition.
Do you think that the events that the entire nation is watching unfold in Wisconsin today, where they face a massive budget deficit, and part of that deficit is attributable to the tremendous benefits and pay packages that go to public employees, including teachers, do you think that that spectacle increases or decreases the chances of things like school reform in your state, school choice?
It makes it much more likely because if in fact you've got teachers just boycotting the classroom, leaving parents in the lurch, some of them now, they can't go to work because they have to watch their children, the public sector unions are going to reduce their own acceptability in the eyes of the public by these kind of antics.
Delegate Bob Marshall, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Appreciate it greatly.
Thank you.